The Yasaka Maru sinking was a brief matter of great international interest, further proof that civilians were still targets in the current war. Greater disasters preceded it, and would follow, but that didn't stop the ship's name from being added to a growing list of grievances that would lead to an even larger war.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the Yasaka Maru Gets No Warning?
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Yasaka Maru sank, bow first, the passengers in the bobbing lifeboats around her. There was a dull explosion, and a lot of smoke and fire coming out of the funnel. The stern lifted into the air, standing almost straight up. One of the ship's boys at the last moment had thought to hoist the Japanese flag on her stern, and it fluttered over the ship as she began to disappear. Behind the ship's boats, they could see something else watching. A periscope was out of the water, also watching the sinking vessel. Captain Yamawaki ordered the lifeboats to be tied together so that they would not get separated, and they turned in the direction of Port Said, where they had telegraphed for help before abandoning the stricken ship. With the port 70 miles away, they could hope that help would soon arrive. The Yasaka Maru had only been completed on October of 1914, making her only a little over a year old when she sank on December 21st, 1915. She was one of the largest steamships of her day, at 11,900 tons. She had been built at the Kawasaki dockyard and was owned by the Nippon Usen Kaisha line, traveling between Great Britain and Japan. Even as the Great War made travel more and more dangerous, the Yasaka Maru continued on her route, though not without incident. The Yasaka Maru was on her second ever voyage when she was attacked by a Zeppelin bombing while anchored in the Thames. She survived the encounter and returned to Japan, where Captain Yamawaki took splinter from one of the bombs and had it framed. Once it was ready for presentation, he had dedicated it to the Yasaka Shrine in Kyoto, for which his ship was named. Hoping for the same shrine's protection on his next voyage, he and his crew visited the shrine before setting out from Japan in September 1915, headed once again for London. Captain Yamawaki had every reason to be concerned about the danger to himself and his crew. As the war had escalated, U-boats had began to target merchant vessels, sometimes with warnings and a chance for civilians to escape, but at other times without any warning at all. Only a few months before the Yasaka Maru left Japan, Germany had caused much international discussion by sinking the Lusitania with great loss of life. The United States government protested about the manner in which submarine warfare was being fought, and asked that Germany issue a warning so that civilians could be evacuated before sinking ships, to prevent the loss of life to non-combatants. Germany worried about Britain announcing they were going to start arming merchant vessels, as well as the danger to their U-boats when they surfaced. They did not see the practicality in this suggestion. This meant that while the Yasaka Maru had already suffered damage from above by Zeppelin attack, they also needed to worry about attacks from below. The voyage to Britain was without incident, and having loaded a cargo of iron and other shipbuilding materials, $12,500,000 in gold, as well as 120 passengers, the Yasaka Maru left London on the 4th of December to head back to Japan. The war had taken a heavy toll on people's desire to travel and to risk ocean voyages. The Yasaka Maru had accommodations for 120 in first class, 60 second class, and 190 steerage passengers. She was not even traveling at half capacity as she left Britain. Indeed, though contemporary sources disagree on how many crew members she had, putting the number between 160 to 260 crew members. No matter the number, the crew outnumbered the passengers. It was hard to blame anyone for being reluctant to take a ship. While the Yasaka Maru had been headed towards Britain, another high-profile merchant ship had fallen victim to a U-boat. This time it had been the Ancona, a prized new vessel in the Italian passenger service. She had been sank by U-boat U-38, showing the Austro-Hungarian flag while off Cape Carbonara. Once again, there had been a heavy cost of human life. It was enough to remind any passengers who did choose to travel that they were putting themselves in grave danger. As for Captain Yamawaki, he and his crew did their best to remain alert, trying to spot the small periscope in the water that would announce to them that their ship was in danger. The Yasaka Maru had made a stop in Marseille and then entered the Mediterranean Sea, passing the Malta Channel and nearing Egypt, with the intention of taking the Suez Canal. Passengers would later describe the events that followed. Many of them had been resting around 2:30 in the afternoon on December 21st, when a horrible explosion had rocked the ship without warning. Some of the people who had been standing or walking around the ship found themselves knocked off their feet by the impact, even as the passengers were still getting their bearings after the shock. The crew of the Yasaka Maru had already begun to swing out the lifeboats and make the announcement that everyone needed to evacuate the ship. Concerned that a second torpedo might follow, this time to the stern of the ship, no one wasted any time to follow the order. The evacuation of the ship would take a total of 10 minutes, and the passengers would later stress the complete order and calm of the crew. It was only when all of the passengers had been evacuated that the crew began to make their way off of the ship. Captain Yamawaki was the last man off of the ship, something that caused some of the passengers concern. There was some worry that he might choose to go down with the ship rather than abandon her, and it was to their relief that he also left the ship and began to give the orders that would keep the lifeboats together until help could arrive. As the lifeboats were roped together, the Yasaka Maru began to sink, a mere 15 minutes after she had first been struck. Within the space of 50 minutes, she could no longer be seen above the ocean. The people in the lifeboats now had a chance to take stock of the situation for the first time. In spite of the ship's telegraph for help, none of the transports that passed them stopped. This was a source of relief, rather than concern for the people in the boats, however. The officers put forward the theory that the Yasaka Maru had been torpedoed to lure in nearby military vessels, and that when such a vessel would come to help them, the waiting U-boat would strike. This suspicion was backed up by the periscope that was still watching them, even as the Yasaka Maru slipped beneath the waves. If that was the intention of the U-boat, they were to be disappointed. Even after nightfall, the boats were still floating in the sea. The passengers were given a good opportunity to discuss what they had managed to save and what they had lost while they bobbed in the sea. Some of the poorer passengers had lost everything, while some of the more wealthy passengers had managed to grab their money, jewelry, and a few important papers before being evacuated. A barber in one of the boats had thought to grab 3 coats, which he handed out to the passengers who had not been able to grab one in the hurry to evacuate. He then began to grieve for his pet parrot, which he had not been able to save. An officer's wife nearby had been able to save her tiny Yorkshire Terrier by putting it in her muff. She had her fur coat on, but was lacking a dress or hat. She announced happily to everyone that she had been able to save her husband's medals in the rush, even though she had not been able to grab his sword. Considering the danger of travel, some of the passengers had insured their belongings. It would not be enough for a full replacement of everything they had lost. For the most part, everyone was just thankful that they had been able to get away with their lives. There had been many examples in the recent past where people had not been so lucky. An unnamed French gunboat set out at 5 p.m. from Port Said after the telegraph from the Yasaka Maru for help was received. It was not until midnight that they were able to reach the lifeboats, however. Even then, they approached with caution, and though they fired a rocket in response to the distress signals from the boats, the crew of the French ship later admitted that they had guns trained on the boats as well, in case they were a screen for a submarine. Once they were certain that there was no lurking danger, they began the process of bringing everyone on board. Since the identity of the French ship is not given, it is hard to know her exact size. But the descriptions from the passengers as well as the papers, who all stress how small she was, it is clear that she was almost not up to the task of taking on everyone from the Yasaka Maru. At least one passenger would later complain that the boat had been dirty and smelly, and that they had all been packed so tightly that at one point she had been forced to sit on a torpedo for lack of anywhere else to go. No matter the shortcomings of the French gunboat, there were no complaints about how they were treated by the crew and captain of the ship, who did everything possible to make them comfortable in spite of the circumstances until they reached Port Said around 10:30 in the morning of the 22nd. News of the fate of the Yasaka Maru preceded them, and as they entered the port, the crews of the naval vessels lined up and climbed the yards of their ships to cheer for them. The French flagship was in the port as well, and on board of her, the band struck up the Japanese anthem. Once they were on shore, they found themselves in the capable hands of an agent from the owners of the Yasaka Maru, who immediately did everything they could to make them comfortable in some of the nicest hotels that the city had to offer. The passengers quickly found that the military and naval men in the port would also do everything they could think of to make up for their ordeal. So while many of the passengers were still shaken by the entire series of events, they could not say that they were neglected. In turn, the passengers heaped praise on the captain and crew of the Yasaka Maru, whose calm and quick actions they credited with keeping everyone alive. Captain Yamawaki was soon on a tour of thanks, along with a representative from the shipping line to give thanks to the commanders of both the British and French naval vessels for their kindness and goodwill. Everywhere he went, he found that more praise was heaped on the shoulder of himself and his men for their good conduct. Eventually, the shipping line would find a French ship that they could have take their passengers on the remainder of their voyage, and attentions turned to discovering what had happened. The first question that everyone wanted to know was whether or not the Yasaka Maru had been warned before the torpedo had struck. If they had been warned, it meant that the United States demands that U-boats warn civilian vessels before bombing them had been honored. At first, it was speculated that the ship had been warned due to the lack of fatalities. It seemed impossible that everyone would be fine if the ship had not been warned. It was only when the passengers and crew were asked that it came out that there had been no warning, and then the question turned to who was responsible. The United States, who put forward an inquiry to both the German and Austro-Hungarian governments, on the grounds that one of the people who had been on the Yasaka Maru had been an American citizen. They had put forward to both governments before that even if none of their citizens were injured, they considered it an offense to the country that a citizen had been placed in undue danger by the U-boat attacks. Baron Erich Zwijdenek replied that while the Austro-Hungarian government was considering what to do in regards of the Ancona, a decision that had been delayed by the Christmas holiday, he knew nothing about an attack on the Yasaka Maru. It would later be learned that U-38, the same vessel that had sank the Ancona, had also been responsible for the sinking of the Yasaka Maru. The Austro-Hungarian government could be excused for their ignorance, however. This time he had been flying the German flag. The U-boat commander, Max Valentiner, would be awarded the Pour le Mérite, Prussia's highest military award. This seems partially in recognition of his ship's patrol of the Mediterranean, during which U-38 sank 23 enemy ships, warships, and merchant vessels alike, as well as 2 neutral ships. After World War I, the British would list Valentina as a war criminal for these same actions. Japan was naturally the hardest hit by the sinking of the Yasaka Maru. Almost immediately, the Nippon Yusen Kaisha line ordered all of its captains abroad to bring their ships into safe ports and await further orders. In a few days, they issued a new order. Their ships were to avoid the Suez Canal completely, for the time being, and instead go around the Cape. The Mediterranean had become too dangerous. The shipbuilding materials that had gone down with the Yasaka Maru were heavily felt in the dockyards of Japan, with some projects having to slow or stop until more metal could be acquired. Voices in the Japanese government strongly suggested that if Germany was going to continue acts such as these, they would no longer be able to treat German prisoners with as much kindness as they had been. Then there was the gold. Though the cargo and ship had been insured, with the Japanese government carrying some of the responsibility of paying if anything happened to the ship, the news that $12,500,000 in gold was now at the bottom of the ocean stirred public interest. It would not be until 1925 that it would be announced that the Japanese Deep Sea Company had recovered gold bars from the wreck of the Yasaka Maru. The vessel, they said, was now laying at a depth of 240 feet. On December 27th, only days after the sinking of the Yasaka Maru, the French liner, the Ville de la Ciotat, was torpedoed without warning and sank. If the passengers of the Yasaka Maru wanted a reminder of their good fortune, it was the news arriving that the sinking of the Ville de la Ciotat had drowned 79 people. Though there was little or no consequence at the time for the sinking of these vessels, other than international outrage, in 1917, American President Woodrow Wilson announced that America was declaring war on Germany. One of the reasons given was the continued German submarine warfare, costing American lives. This story does have a romantic epilogue. When the Yasaka Maru was torpedoed, 2 complete strangers met for the first time. A Mr. Newhouse, a worker in the Public Works Department in Hong Kong, helped a Miss Hancock of Broadstairs to escape the sinking ship. Having spent time together in the lifeboats, and then in port said, once the 2 returned to China, they continued a correspondence. Mr. Newhouse lived in Hong Kong, and Miss Hancock lived in Shanghai. But through their letters, the 2 became increasingly familiar until on the 10th of February, 1917, when the 2 were married.
For more information, please see the Japan Chronicle, issues 957 to 978, or see our other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.